Please join us in welcoming Professor Willard McCarty, whom we all look forward to hearing. Willard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Boer Elizabeth, and to the distinguished rector of the university, and to Dr. Kisner, whom I was very much looking forward to meeting online at least, but that is not to be. And I must confess, I'm very sad not to be in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. I had long looked forward to wandering in the woods there, but that's been prevented. So I am glad in proxy to be with you and for the opportunity to think again about matters I've mulled over for quite a number of years. What I have for you is in part the paper that, as I understand, has already been circulated and which you may have read. And in addition to that paper, some glosses on it because I couldn't leave it alone. So you will forgive me, I hope, if I divert from the text of the paper occasionally to criticize it, comment on it, and add to it. As I wrote about a decade ago in a question period after a lecture I gave at Cambridge, a mischievous man asked me where I thought computers would be in 20 years. Now, I've continued to ponder that question. It really stuck. But recently, I have supplemented that question with a question about the question. And that is, why have I for so long, certainly since the Busa lecture in 2013, but before then, thought about the future? This is not, I assure you, a function of my age. It is, I've discovered in the process of a recent research project, well, one that's ongoing into the early history of artificial intelligence, that it is in the nature of our subject to think of the future. Mike Mahoney, the historian of technology, Mike Mahoney's comment comes to mind that computers have always turned our eyes to the future because they make promises that they never quite deliver on and always make us hope for a revised version or something that will become possible. This is actually far more important than it sounds, and I hope I can open it up a bit. But at the core, it is a direction to be aware of what is missing, where and how we go to find out. This is not so much a stock taking as what a former teacher of mine, Northrop Frye, quoting William Blake, called expanding eyes. How do we learn about that? I'm taking a run at it here, but more than that, to suggest to everyone that there is a reason for each of us to ponder matters of disciplinary purpose and direction as best we can, as often as we can. Not to define digital humanities, a discipline is not for the defining, but to question and shape and direct it. Such pondering has strengthened my conviction that the physical machine must never be taken for granted, that the machine is where our questioning must begin, and that all the disciplines of the human sciences and much else offer crucial help, which we need. We indeed need this help, but we need it on our terms. Relative disciplinary ignorance and immaturity, not our immaturity, but the discipline's immaturity, make us vulnerable to facile solutions. Two especially. One is to succumb to the widely supported fantasy of unqualified progress, and so to the belief that the questions of research are for answering rather than deepening. The other is to take the purpose and direction of the discipline from somewhere else, surrendering the struggle to someone else's agenda. And then, likely beneath critical notice, lurk some bad but stubborn notions about computing that must be weeded out. I'll come back to one of these in particular a bit later. But after all those warnings and such, we have, I realize, good reason, cautiously at least, to celebrate. With regards to institutional matters, we have indeed much to be happy about. Conditions were not always so favorable. 30 years ago, some of you will remember that, 30 years ago, the distinguished historian of religion, Jaroslav Pelikan, made what was then a startling move by proposing that academic status be given to non-academic research staff, as he said, such as I then was, not as a matter of courtesy, much less as a matter of condescension, but as a matter of justice and of accuracy. Humanist was created in 1987, passive voice because it took more than one person to do it, in that atmosphere of suppression of talent coming from non-academic sources. Originally, humanist was quite a revolutionary movement. It quieted down rather quickly, but it did start out with the objective of righting those wrongs. And they have been righted. We have moved from feeding on the crumbs that fell off the table of the tenured to take our places among them as colleagues. Such is the opportunity we have struggled for and won, with a great deal of help from current fashions. But please make no mistake, ours is not a sinecure, but an opportunity to show our colleagues in other disciplines that the investment they have made in our thing at the expense of spending it elsewhere is paying off, not merely in large grants and the like, but in ways that will last. So I must ask, what are we doing with this opportunity while we still have it before it slips away or goes stale? The theme of the conference, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Data, brings me to that question by way of the great ethnographic historian Greg Denning's metaphor of the disciplines. He wrote in one of his little essays, where once we thought a discipline, history say, or politics, or even economics, was at the center of things by having a blinkered view of humanity, now we realize that we are all on the edge of things in a great ring of viewers. A very Australian metaphor, that. What then do we do within that nexus of relations? What do we have to contribute to all those others sitting in this great ring of viewers, and what do we have to learn from them? This is a matter of, as I like to put it, becoming interdisciplinary. I will try to suggest a number of those connections through the rest of the talk. I think we have, under the category of what we've done, I think we have a fairly good start on understanding the input end of the machine, that is digitalization of data, including how to encode these data, and on developing tools for manipulation, analysis, visualization, and so on, as many of the many papers of this conference suggest better than I could. But do we have a good theory of the data to account not only for that which we successfully translate into computable form, but especially for that which does not survive and perhaps could after a suitable change of mind and or machine? Or are we still brushing the losses under the carpet, calling them residue? Recently, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute of London published a special issue entitled Towards an Anthropology of Data, about how discourses, practices, and imaginaries of data are configuring and inflecting the familiar in unfamiliar or surprising ways. I commend this issue to you as an example of how thinking from another discipline back to digital humanities is of enormous benefit. Then there's the middle and final stages of computing. I strongly suspect that we have very little grasp of them, that is, of the events within the black box between input and output, and then of the recursive interactions between inquirer and machine, from output back to input to more output, and so on. On that latter point, Marvin Minsky pointed out in 1965 that the relationship of modeling is trinary, 3 ways, between real-world artifact, the computational model of it, and the modeler. Have our theories of modeling taken account of that, especially in relation to all that goes on with and within the modeler? And there's more. How about the social context within which the modeler is working? Much to be done, although I suspect and hope that much of this is already underway. But let me proceed as if the abyss of my ignorance were not as large and deep as I suspect it is. So, if I'm right, there are 3 problems to work on. First, a theory of digitalization that would fit into a very short introduction style booklet and be comprehensible to students and colleagues alike. Perhaps one of you is putting that together now. An accessible account of as much as is knowable concerning the structure of and events within system software and hardware of that black box. And third, a better idea of what happens when we work with the machine materially, cognitively, psychologically, intellectually, with its social nexus. This involves looking into, among other fields, hardware and software engineering, psychology, anthropology, and other disciplines of the cognitive sciences. Hardware and software engineering is likely to seem the most challenging at first, but it is vital. Although there is more to be done on the first of these, starting inter alia with Jerome McGann's suggestions, that is, in coding, I've belabored it elsewhere, and so we'll leave it alone for now. The second is essentially the problem that faces all genuinely interdisciplinary research, in this case, requiring a substantial amount of extraction and translation of highly technical sources from engineering, other areas of computer science, and from mathematics. The job is not impossible, only time-consuming and quite laborious, involving native informants as well as printed and online sources. But the rewards from doing it are substantial. A much clearer and more persuasive idea of our contribution to the machine's further development, in which I think we have a crucial role to play, and a better language in which to conceptualize and communicate it. The third problem, bringing our manipulatory cognitive actions with the tool and its responses into view, falls under the concerns of research in human-computer interaction, the cognitive sciences, especially cognitive psychology and anthropology, among other fields. This is to be explored. To my mind, the most difficult, exciting, and promising challenges lie with this problem. I'll devote the rest of my time here to it with some backward glances at the second, the internals of the machine. In the language familiar to the human sciences, research with the machine means putting questions to it. At the moment, we don't do this by speaking, say, to a really smart Alexa, but by taking other sorts of physical actions that lead to other sorts of physical responses. Nevertheless, it is productive to think of what we do as asking questions. In those terms, 2 corresponding socio-cultural models present themselves: conversation and divination. This involves conversation analysis and what is called in the trade social intelligence, as well as anthropology. For reasons of time, I must give divination a short shrift. Indeed, you may be glad of that. It may have shocked you already. But a few salient things about divination are suggestive. The first is that divination may be considered a kind of physically mediated conversation with the gods, if you like, or with whatever we put in their place. Second, belief is not required to see how divinatory practices work. The highly developed resources of historical and anthropological scholarship help us find this out. Then to tap into millennia of cross-cultural accounts of how others have sought answers to their most pressing and difficult questions. Finally, no less than Alan Turing turned to it in the form of an oracle machine as a model for our intuitive ability to excel the explanatory power of mechanical processes. Conversation can be equally mysterious as divination if you think about it. Not so much the tedious, well-worn verbal routine with unsurprising outcome anticipated by the question, are we really going to have that conversation? Rather, I mean conversation of the kind that Gadamer talks about in Truth and Method, the kind that is unplanned, the kind we drift into and are led by rather than lead, the kind that surprises rather than fulfills expectations. In his 1950 paper on machine intelligence, Turing argued that the digital machine could genuinely surprise us. Indeed, but for greater memory and speed, Babbage's analytical engine could have done this as well. Just this year, Kazuo Ishiguro in Clara and the Sun has imagined the conversation and interior dialogue of a replicant or artificial friend, and by exploring how far it could go, has done much to sharpen the question. I will return to Clara a bit later. Unfortunately, human-computer interaction studies seem not to have done much with research in conversation analysis, or what the practitioners call talk and interaction. See Lucy Suchman on this. But their research and that of related areas in the cognitive sciences continue apace. While plausible implementation may be long, long way off, keeping in touch with that research seems to me part of our job. But we need more. We need, as I suggested earlier, actual and detailed knowledge of hardware and software. Langdon Winter put the question to his colleagues in the philosophy of technology, another field we need to know about. He asked, how much do we need to know about the machine? What kind of knowledge do we need to have, and how much? He recommended looking carefully, this is a quotation, carefully at the inner workings of real technologies and their histories to see what is actually taking place. Without that knowledge, it seems to me, we cannot speak with authority about the digital machine and its possibilities for the human sciences and beyond. Without it, we cannot understand fully what we are doing. Historian Timothy Lenoir notes the difficulties and suggests how to proceed. He says, by getting inside the technology and bending it to our purposes when and where we can. But that does not compel us to turn our backs on the metaphoric uses of technology as he suggests we should. What does compel us is the defining imperative to bring both together in a field of relations, together with whatever the other human sciences can contribute. 50 years ago, in Science and Technology and Art Today, anthropologist Jonathan Benthel suggested why this assembly is so important for the conversational problem I have raised. The essence of most computer jokes, he observed, is that whenever we choose to assign the computer in the, wherever we choose to assign the computer in the social hierarchy, as slave or oracle or working partner, its anomalous nature will assert itself. Ordinarily, this anomalous nature is by design, by a friend of mine calls it extravagant engineering. It's screened out, so we don't see it. We need to look for it and to cultivate it. Its no-name uncanny manifestations signal a fault of conception or engineering only if we set imitation of the human as our goal. Otherwise, in circumstances of research, these defamiliarizing phenomena are the very means of discovery. If I'm right about this, then we need even more help, this time from those at the coalface, to get into the causes of that anomalous nature. For example, and I recommend this to you very strongly, as a starting point, pay attention to engineer Jim Keller's, chip designer, engineer Jim Keller's first interview by Lex Fridman on YouTube. Among other things, Keller describes how non-deterministic behaviors at the microchip level are exploited for maximum processing speed, but controlled to produce the deterministic result on which so much depends. Since the mid-20th century, when mathematician John von Neumann worried about how digital processes could produce reliable results from unreliable components, as the human brain does far better than our most sophisticated machines, he pointed out, extravagant hardware and software engineering have shaped the unruly behavior of physical electronics to produce closest possible approximation to the ideal machine, that is, the machine that we imagine that we have. Much to admire there, of course, but to my mind, the important realization for the future, and here I step out onto the thinnest of ice, is that this control of non-deterministic behavior is tunable. Now for a bit of what Clifford Geertz called intellectual weed control. I spoke earlier about weeding out some bad ideas. Among the most persistent and pernicious of these is the notion that the computer is a machine in what Marvin Minsky called the pre-computational sense. One that, to quote Ada Lovelace's well-known dictum, can do only whatever we know how to order it to perform. Thus, in 1955, Grace Hopper declared that the computer is an extremely fast moron that will, at the speed of light, do exactly what it is told to do, no more, no less. The moron story is told very entertainingly by Pamela McCordick, the Machines Who Think person, who alleges, and her authority is usually pretty good on these things, that IBM got frightened by the amazing successes of Arthur Samuel and others who are working on early artificially intelligent simulations of board games. And they were afraid that customers would see artificial intelligence coming and get scared and not buy their machines. So the executives decided to put out this story that the computer was only a fast moron. And if you trace this word in the literature, as I have, it just propagates like wild from the time that Grace Hopper uttered it until it even is found now in the literature. So this expression, fast moron, its variants and pre-computational image it evokes, have given debilitating reassurances to the frightened, namely that the digital machine cannot outsmart us. Herbert Simon pointed out in 1960 that the image of the machine as a rote follower of instructions is, and I quote, intuitively obvious and indubitably true, but supports none of the implications that are commonly drawn from it. I recommend to you put that into your head and think about it for a while. Thus, we wrongly infer that how the computational machine carries out its instructions is predetermined, and that the surprise, which I talked about earlier, is a trivial matter of human error, stupidity, or forgetfulness. Two features of the machine nullify this assumption: conditional interactions among components and stimuli external to it, that is, conditional branching and instruction rewriting, as well as signals that come from outside the machine. Two others, mnemonic capacity and speed, take those to a new level. If you read carefully what Lovelace wrote, you read that she goes on to say that limiting surprise to trivial causes is a mistake, when, as many who have quoted her dictum overlook, she wrote that the recombinatorial potential of Babbage's engine, hence of our own, would throw new light on the relations and nature of many subjects, leading to more profound investigation of them. Undervaluing the intellectual potential of combinatorics impoverishes us. Remember that when I get to Italo Calvino's essay. And if you can find a combinatorial mathematician, corner this person and talk to them. It does so because from the mathematics of the combinatorial art at speed and with capacity, the machine gains complexity. In simplest terms, a complex system is one in which interaction among components predominates over any governing set of rules, so that surprising behaviors emerge. A tropical rainforest ecosystem with an almost endless variety of species in constant development and rapid evolution is an example. Now, complexity theory is wild stuff, not for the faint-hearted. Asked for a definition, experts will often retreat to an "I know it when I see it" defense. But for now, we need only this, that as we proceed from the strictly linear and rule-governed, which in fact is very hard to find, toward the increasingly unpredictable, we reach a point of a potentially innovating randomness. Complexity theorists call this the edge of chaos. Questions and qualifications crowd in, however. First is what is meant by random, for which I propose beyond our ability to anticipate. Second, our relation to random stimuli, particularly how they affect us and what we do with them. Third, how generation of these stimuli is tuned. I will return to these questions at the end. On this point, I recommend to your attention a recently translated novel from Benjamin Labatut, When We Cease to Understand the World, for a bit of edge of chaos stuff. So up to this point, see how I'm doing for time all this time. Up to this point, I have approached our common ground mostly from the side of the machine. I've done so because, as I suggested, our discipline has downplayed technical knowledge of the physical device and its sciences, the digital in digital humanities, the mathematics in algorithm. But then, as I said, the metaphoric has to be an equal player. For that reason, I now turn to three literary ways of thinking about the machine in its field of relations, and to bring us up to date, take up the unavoidable subject of artificial intelligence. I suggest we need to put imaginative literature to work in our minds better to understand these things. In our terms, as I interpret them, AI's central problem of knowledge became clear quite early. The most succinct statement of it I know, and I've quoted this before, I love it, is from a 1971 book review by the pioneering system scientist Sir Charles Jeffrey Vickers in the Times Literary Supplement on the social impact of the computer. In his words, this is it: how playing of a role differs from the application of rules which could and should be made explicit and compatible. Think of the difference between following rules and learning to ride a bicycle, or being a good mother, or any of the other things that many of us master very quickly. 50 years on, this remains a fair statement of the epistemological problem Ishiguro takes up with his Clara, a machine who thinks, as Pamela McCordick would say. Among her artificial kind, and you really do have to read the novel, I can only manage a very brief summary of the one little bit of it. Among her artificial kind, Clara distinguishes herself by the ability to construct her world from observations. She is not the most up-to-date model of her kind, we are told, but the shop manager remarks when selling Clara, her appetite for observing and learning and ability to absorb and blend everything she sees around her is quite amazing. As a result, she now has the most sophisticated understanding of any AF, that is artificial friend, in this store. Much later, after the sale to a family, her owner's father, Paul, raises the question of artificial intelligence, though Ishiguro never uses this term. Whether a machine of finite states can stretch beyond her finitude. Paul asks Clara whether she thinks there is a human heart in the poetic sense, something that makes each of us special and individual, he says. Clara imagines this heart to be like a house with many rooms, one within another within another. Paul asks, what if there are indefinitely many rooms, one within another, and so on? To this conundrum of infinite regress, as Clifford Geertz says in one of his essays, quoting a traditional explanation of the universe, of turtles all the way down, Clara responds that the human heart must be limited. Even in the poetic sense, she declares, there'll be an end to what there is to learn. And so, at the novel's end, having served her purpose to the letter, Clara is thrown away, left in a junkyard. One has to ask oneself at this point, what is the point of the anthropological infinite regress? What does that tell us about the point at which Clara has reached as a sentient artificial friend? My second example is Stephen Millhauser's late 20th century short story, The New Automaton Theater. Millhauser imagines a small German city in which everyone from birth is completely under the spell of the human-like automata that their master craftsmen make. These automata are, the narrator says, carried by our masters to a pitch of brilliance unequaled elsewhere and unimagined by the masters of an earlier age. They are the source of our richest and most spiritual pleasure. Suddenly, after a long unexplained absence, the greatest craftsman of them all, Heinrich Graum, returns with radically new ideas. He devises then stages performances of an utterly new kind of automata, ones that do not imitate the human, but who have grown conscious of themselves, a new race with lives parallel to ours, but are not to be confused with ours. These strange automata are thus not creatures lingering in Masahiro Mori's well-known and much explored Uncanny Valley. They are profoundly, shockingly, differently, intentionally themselves. The old art flourishes, the narrator concludes, but something new and strange has come into the world. We may try to explain it, but what draws us is the mystery, for our dreams have changed. Consider for a moment most of what AI is trying to do, which is catoptric mirror-like imitation of the human versus developing that anomalous nature of the machine that I mentioned earlier. There's a brilliant example of this going on right now in Japan, in Kyoto, about which an article I hope is soon to appear in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute about a bodhisattva, an artificial bodhisattva in a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. And the way that the Zen priests think about this artificial bodhisattva is absolutely fascinating and suggestive of a way of our thinking about artificial intelligence and its possible role in the world. With my third and last example, as promised, I take up Italo Calvino's remarkably insightful lecture from the mid-20th century, Cybernetics and Ghosts, on the relation of the digital machine to writing and to literature. I skip the two routes his argument follows to get to his fundamental question. How is it that the new, or better, the unrealized, can arise within the constraints of language and literary traditions? Abbreviating as much as I dare, this is his response. Literature is a combinatorial game that pursues the possibilities implicit in its own material, independent of the personality of the poet. But it is a game that at certain point is invested with an unexpected meaning that has slipped in from another level. The literature machine can perform all the permutations possible on a given material, but the poetic result will be the particular effect of one of these permutations on a man endowed with a consciousness and an unconscious, that is, an empirical and historical man. It will be the shock that occurs only if the writing machine is surrounded by the hidden ghosts of the individual and of his society. Like but different than the digital machine Lovelace described a century before him, Calvino makes no claim for the writer's absolute originality. Rather that, in Lovelace's words, in so distributing and combining the truths and the formulae, the relations and the literature of many subjects are necessarily thrown into new lights and more profoundly investigated. Thus, Calvino, with Claude Lévi-Strauss explicitly in mind, has his storyteller of the tribe continue imperturbably making his permutations of jaguars and toucans until the moment comes when one of his innocent little tales explodes into a terrible revelation. So then, in conclusion, what do I think the lesson is here? I bring it to you in two flavors, pragmatic and metaphysical. For the pragmatic, I refer again to historian Mike Mahoney's advice from a recent history of technology, to get ourselves into the driver's seat, then to ask, with intention to commit, what we want to do and what we are willing to spend to do it. Driving, or giving effective advice to the driver, I've argued, requires technical knowledge and the insight that comes from it. Such knowledge not only focuses desire, but awakens it, brings to the fore such exercises of the imagination as I briefly presented. These and much, much more of them, and not only literary ones, but also the artistic, musical, and however expressive, are likewise the tools of our craft. Their applicability is possible because the technologies we play with, though many forget or ignore this, are of the human sciences already, waiting for greater realization under knowledgeable hands. For the metaphysical, I turn to another favorite passage of mine in the preface of Terry Winograd and Fernando Flores' book, Understanding Computers and Cognition. This is how I end my talk. All new technologies, they write there, develop within the background of a tacit understanding of human nature and of human work. The use of technology in turn leads to fundamental changes in what we do, and ultimately in what it is to be human. We encounter the deep questions of design when we recognize that in designing tools, we are designing ways of being. So there you have it. What ways of being do we want to open for ourselves? Thank you very much.